What would you do if the only thing you inherited was a joke? If the sum total of a life's work was a deed to a worthless strip of canyon, a place defined by a waterfall so useless for irrigation that its name, Vale's Folly, was spoken with a pitying shake of the head? For Catherine Vale, arriving in the dust-choked town of Redemption Gulch, Colorado, in the summer of 1883, this was not a question, but a reality, folded into a worn leather satchel alongside her father's pocket watch and the last of her savings. He had left her a punchline, a piece of land notable only for its stubborn refusal to be tamed, a thin ribbon of water crashing into a gorge too deep and narrow to be of any use to a rancher or a farmer. But what no one in that town knew, what even Catherine was only beginning to suspect, was that the water itself was a curtain. And behind it, her father had hidden a secret of stone and iron, a legacy not of folly, but of impossible foresight. Settle in and let us know where you're watching from, as we tell a story of the quiet courage it takes to listen to the land when the world is telling you to walk away. Catherine Vale stepped down from the stagecoach, the hem of her gray traveling dress immediately gathering a fine layer of ochre dust. She was 27, but the grief of the past month had carved faint lines around her eyes that made her seem older. Her hair, the color of dark honey, was pulled back in a severe bun, as if to brook no nonsense from the wind or the prying eyes of the men loitering on the saloon porch. Redemption Gulch wasn't a town that welcomed strangers, especially not a woman alone. It was a place of hard men and harder bargains, where a person's worth was measured in acres of grazing land or the weight of ore pulled from the surrounding hills. Catherine had neither. She had a deed, signed in her father's shaky hand just a week before he'd passed. He'd been a strange man in his later years, a prospector who'd stopped looking for gold and had started listening to rocks, he'd said. He'd spent the last decade of his life buying this one impossible parcel, paying the taxes with whatever odd jobs he could find, ignoring the laughter of his peers. In his last days, his mind clouded with fever, he'd held her hand, his own as dry and brittle as a leaf. "It's not the water, Cat," he'd whispered, his voice a rasp. "It's the weight of it. Remember the weight." She hadn't understood then, and she didn't understand now, but the words had lodged in her heart like a river stone. She clutched her satchel, the stiff paper of the deed a tangible link to him, her only link. She could sell it for pennies, enough for a ticket back east to a life of quiet servitude as a governess or a seamstress. It was the sensible thing to do. But as she looked past the ramshackle buildings to the distant, jagged peaks of the San Juan Mountains, she felt a stubbornness she'd inherited from him take root. She would see it first. She would stand on the land he'd chosen over everything else. Before she let them laugh her out of the territory, she would see his folly with her own eyes. Her worn boots made little sound on the plank sidewalk as she walked toward the land and title office, the afternoon sun casting a long, solitary shadow behind her. The air in the land and title office was stale with the scent of old paper and cigar smoke. A portly, well-dressed man with a silver watch chain stretched tight across his vest looked up from his ledger as she entered. He was Silas Thorne, a man whose business was turning the dreams of others into neat columns of profit for himself. His smile was polished and predatory. "Miss Vale," he said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "I was told to expect you. My condolences on the loss of your father." The words were correct, but the tone was dismissive, as if her father's passing were a minor inconvenience in the day's business. Catherine simply nodded, placing the deed on the polished oak counter between them. Thorne picked it up, his thick fingers tracing the boundaries of the claim. A smirk played at the corner of his lips. Ah, yes. Vale's Folly. A beautiful piece of scenery, to be sure. Utterly worthless, of course. He leaned back in his chair, a picture of condescending authority. The water drops 100 feet into a gorge no wider than this office. Can't run a ditch from it. Can't water a single head of cattle. Your father was an idealist. He named a price, a pittance so small it was an insult. He framed it as a kindness, a way for her to salvage something from her father's foolishness. Take it, Miss Vale. Buy yourself a ticket back to civilization. There's nothing for you here but dust and disappointment. His eyes held a flicker of impatience, of a man used to getting his way, especially with those he deemed his inferiors. But Catherine's gaze was steady. She remembered her father's calloused hands, the quiet conviction in his eyes when he spoke of this place. She remembered his last words. "I'm not selling," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I need the title transferred and the claim recorded in my name." Thorne's smile vanished. He stared at her, his expression shifting from pity to irritation. "Don't be a fool, girl. That land will break you. It's nothing but rock and noise." He gestured dismissively toward the window. "This is hard country. It has no time for sentiment." "Nevertheless," Catherine replied, her voice unwavering, "record the claim." Defeated by her simple refusal, Thorne grumbled and began the paperwork, his pen scratching angrily across the page. As she left the office, the new deed tucked safely in her satchel, she felt the weight of the town's collective judgment. Whispers followed her from the saloon, from the general store, from the women sweeping their porches. She was her father's daughter, another fool chasing a ghost in a canyon that had already claimed one man's sanity. What was she thinking, clinging to a piece of useless rock? Was it stubborn pride? Or did she truly believe her father had seen something no one else could? What secret could a worthless waterfall possibly hold, buried under the laughter of an entire town? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe for more stories of quiet courage and hidden truths. For Catherine, the judgment of the town was just noise. The only voice she needed to hear was the one waiting for her in the canyon. The following morning, Catherine purchased supplies from the Redemption Gulch Mercantile, a place where barrels of nails stood next to sacks of flour and bolts of calico. The proprietor, a wiry man named Henderson, was polite enough, but his eyes held the same pity she'd seen all over town. As he weighed out beans and coffee, she could hear men talking near the stove. "Another veil chasing shadows," one muttered. "The old man spent his last dollar on that rock pile. Now the daughters come to starve on it." Their words were like small, sharp stones. Silas Thorne was there too, leaning against the counter, a smug look on his face. He watched as Catherine paid for a coil of thick rope and a heavy pickaxe. "Planning on mining for misery, Miss Vale?" he boomed, loud enough for the entire store to hear. "You'll find a rich vein of it up in that canyon." A few men chuckled. Catherine didn't rise to the bait. She met his gaze for a brief, silent moment, then gathered her things and walked out, her back straight, her dignity a shield he could not pierce. His laughter followed her out into the dusty street. Her transportation was a sturdy gelding named Cinder, a creature as quiet and steadfast as she was. He'd been her father's horse, and his presence was a comfort, a living piece of the man she missed so dearly. She loaded her supplies onto the pack saddle, Cinder standing patiently, his dark eyes seeming to understand the weight of their journey. As they left the last buildings of Redemption Gulch behind, the vast, indifferent landscape of the high desert unfolded around them. The road dwindled to a pair of ruts, then a faint trail winding up into the foothills. The air grew cooler, scented with pine and dust. It was on this trail, miles from any settlement, that she saw the old woman. She was a Ute elder, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, her hands stained with the herbs she was gathering from the side of the trail. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace that spoke of a lifetime spent in these mountains. As Catherine drew near, the woman straightened up, her black eyes studying Catherine and the horse with an unnerving stillness. She didn't smile, but there was no hostility in her gaze. Catherine nodded a respectful greeting. The old woman looked past her, her eyes fixed on the distant V-shape of the canyon entrance. Then she looked back at Catherine and spoke a single sentence, her voice dry and soft as rustling leaves. "Some rock breathes," she said. "Listen for the echo." Without another word, she turned and continued her work, her focus absolute. The encounter was brief, lasting no more than a minute, but the woman's cryptic words settled deep in Catherine's mind, a strange and unsettling premonition. She nudged Cinder forward, the trail ahead seeming wilder now, more mysterious than before. The final leg of the journey was a hard scramble. The trail disappeared entirely, forcing Catherine to dismount and lead Cinder through a maze of fallen rock and thorny scrub oak. The sound reached her before the sight did, a low, constant roar that grew steadily louder, vibrating through the soles of her boots. And then she saw it. She rounded a massive granite boulder, and the canyon opened before her. Vale's Folly. The water was a brilliant silver spear thrown against a wall of dark gray rock, plunging more than 100 feet into a churning, frothing pool below. The gorge was exactly as Thorne had described, narrow, steep, and unforgiving. The walls were sheer cliffs, slick with mist. There was no gentle bank, no flat ground to plow, no way to divert the powerful cascade into a useful channel. It was magnificent, and it was utterly, heartbreakingly useless. A wave of despair washed over her, cold as the spray that drifted on the wind. Thorne was right. The town was right. Her father had wasted his life on a beautiful, worthless spectacle. She made camp on a small, relatively flat patch of ground 50 yards from the pool, the only level spot she could find. As dusk settled, the roar of the waterfall seemed to grow louder, more oppressive. It was not a gentle sound. It was a relentless, crushing force, a sound that promised to fill every silence and scour every quiet thought from her mind. Cinder was restless, his ears twitching, his gaze fixed on the thundering water as if it were a predator. That night, wrapped in her bedroll, Catherine stared into the flames of her small fire, the roar of Vale's Folly a constant, deafening companion. It felt like the sound of her own failure. Days bled into a week. Catherine fell into a Spartan rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of her horse. She cleared a small area for her camp, repaired the dilapidated lean-to her father had built years ago, and spent hours simply watching the water, trying to understand what he had seen in it. The initial disappointment had settled into a dull ache of resignation. The land was beautiful, wild, and wholly indifferent to her. She explored every inch of her small claim, her boots tracing the edges of the narrow gorge. It was all rock, pine, and stubborn, hardy brush. There was nothing here. No pasture, no timber worth felling, no sign of any mineral vein. There was only the waterfall, a monument to her father's beautiful, inexplicable obsession. Yet she could not bring herself to leave. To abandon the place would be to admit that his life, and now her journey, had been for nothing. One afternoon, she walked downstream from the main pool to a calmer eddy to fill her water buckets. The roar of the Cascade was slightly muffled here by a bend in the canyon. It was in that relative quiet that she first heard it. A sound beneath the sound. It was a faint, rhythmic thump, 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 like a slow, deep heartbeat coming from within the stone itself. She froze, listening intently. It was almost imperceptible, easily lost in the overwhelming noise of the falls. She moved closer to the gorge wall, pressing her ear against the cold, damp granite. The vibration was there, a steady, resonant pulse that had nothing to do with the chaotic crash of water. It was too regular, too measured. It felt mechanical. Her mind raced. Was it an echo? A trick of the canyon's acoustics? She followed the sound, scrambling back over the rocks toward the main pool at the base of the waterfall. The thumping grew stronger, clearer, the closer she got. There, right beside the violent churn where the water struck the rock, the vibration was most intense. Her eyes scanned the rock face, searching for anything unusual, and she saw it. Just above the waterline, partially obscured by mist and a tangle of hardy ferns, was a line of stones. Unlike the fractured, random angles of the surrounding cliff, these stones were roughly squared, fitted together in a shallow, almost perfect horizontal line. It was a detail anyone would miss unless they were looking for it, an unnatural seam in the natural chaos. The Ute woman's words returned to her with sudden, shocking clarity. Some rock breathes. Listen for the echo. This rock was breathing. And Catherine was beginning to understand it was not a natural breath. Her hand rested on the cold stone, the steady, hidden pulse vibrating up her arm, a secret message from the past. A new energy surged through her, a fierce and potent curiosity that pushed aside the despair. The next morning, she uncoiled the rope she had bought in town. She tied one end securely around the trunk of a gnarled, ancient pine that grew near the edge of the gorge. The other end she looped around her waist. She took the pickaxe, its weight solid and purposeful in her hands. Her objective was the unnatural line of stones at the base of the waterfall, a place impossible to reach without clearing the treacherous, slick scree that had built up over decades. The work was brutal. The rocks were heavy and slick with a constant freezing mist. Her hands, soft from a life spent more with books than with tools, were quickly blistered and raw. Every muscle in her back and shoulders screamed in protest. Cinder watched her from the campsite, a silent, steady observer. His quiet presence was a comfort, a reminder that she was not entirely alone in this wild place. Several times she would stop, her breath coming in ragged gasps, and meet his dark, patient gaze. It was as if he understood the importance of her labor, his stillness a vote of confidence. Hour after hour she worked, driven by the rhythmic thumping that seemed to call to her from behind the rock. With every rock she pried loose and sent tumbling into the churning pool, she felt a deeper connection to this place, to her father. This was what he must have done. This same back-breaking labor, this same singular focus. Her hands were learning a truth her mind had not yet fully grasped. By the end of the second day, she had cleared a narrow, dangerous path to the strange, man-made ledge. The thumping was louder here, a powerful, resonant beat that you could feel in your teeth. It was the undeniable sound of immense water pressure hitting something solid and hollow on the other side of the rock face. She rested, her body aching, and studied the curtain of water. It was a solid, impenetrable wall of force. To step through it would be madness. But the secret, she knew, was behind it. She remembered the heavy canvas tarp she'd bought, the one Thorn had mocked. She spent the next morning rigging it, using the rope and the pickaxe to anchor one edge of the tarp to the cliff face above the ledge. Slowly, carefully, she managed to stretch the canvas out, creating a crude barrier that diverted a narrow section of the waterfall just enough to create a gap, a space behind the cascade that was more mist than solid water. It was a sliver of an opening, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. She stood on the ledge she had cleared, the roar deafening, the spray soaking her to the skin in seconds. She took a deep breath, the cold air burning her lungs, and prepared to step into the heart of Vale's folly. The shock of the cold was absolute. It was a physical blow that stole her breath and sent a violent tremor through her entire body. For a terrifying moment, she couldn't move, couldn't think. The sheer force of the water threatened to throw her from the ledge, but she braced herself against the rock wall, her raw fingers finding purchase on the slick stone, and pushed her way through the churning, freezing chaos. She stumbled through the gap she had made and found herself in a small, sheltered alcove behind the waterfall. The roar was transformed in here, a deafening, echoing thunder that seemed to come from all directions at once. The air was thick with mist, but the ground beneath her feet was solid and miraculously almost dry. As her eyes adjusted to the dim, watery light filtering through the cascade, she saw it. Set into the smooth, dark granite of the cliff face was a door. It was made of thick, heavy planks of wood, bound with bands of black iron that were pitted with age but showed no sign of rust. A simple iron ring served as a handle. It was ancient, impossible, a thing that should not exist in a place like this. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic counterpoint to the slow, steady thump still vibrating through the stone. With trembling hands, she grasped the iron ring. It was cold and unyielding. She pulled, her muscles screaming in protest, putting all of her weight into it. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deep, groaning screech of metal on stone, the door shuddered and swung inward, opening into absolute darkness. She fumbled in her oilskin pouch for her lantern and a match. Her hands were shaking so badly, it took 3 tries to strike a flame. She lit the wick, and the small, steady glow pushed back the primeval dark. She raised the lantern and stepped across the threshold. The air inside was cool, still, and dry, carrying the faint, clean scent of dust and stone. The chamber was not a natural cave. The walls were smooth, cut with a precision that spoke of painstaking, deliberate labor. Against one wall, a set of mining tools, a rock hammer, chisels, a drill steel, were stacked neatly, their metal heads gleaming in the lantern light. A simple cot with a folded woolen blanket sat in one corner. In the center of the chamber was a small, rough-hewn table and a single stool. And on the table, lying closed as if waiting for her, was a thick, leather-bound ledger. With a sense of reverence, she walked to the table and set down her lantern. She ran her fingers over the worn leather cover before opening it. The first page was dated 30 years prior. The handwriting, bold and clear, was her father's. It was his journal, the secret history of this place. He had found the chamber as a young man, prospecting for silver. But he'd found something far more valuable. Page after page detailed his work, not of mining, but of engineering. He had spent years secretly hand-drilling a diversion tunnel, a bypass that could channel the immense force of the waterfall through the mountain itself. The rhythmic thumping was the sound of the water hitting a sealed, cast-iron pressure gate he had installed deep inside the rock, the key to his entire design. His plan was never about ore. It was about power. Power to run a stamp mill, a sawmill, a grist mill, anything that needed the relentless turning of a wheel. The final entry, written just a year ago in a faltering hand, made tears spring to her eyes. "The world wants gold," he wrote. "I found power. They will not understand until the right hands hold the key. I leave it for Catherine. She has the patience for it." He hadn't left her a folly. He had left her a future. Word of her continued presence in the canyon, like smoke from her campfire, had drifted back to Redemption Gulch. One afternoon, as she was studying her father's intricate diagrams in the ledger, the sound of hoofbeats echoed from the canyon entrance. It was Silas Thorne, and he had brought two hard-faced men with him. His demeanor was no longer mocking. It was predatory. "Miss Vale," he said, his voice slick with false cordiality as he dismounted. "Still here, I see. I've been thinking about your situation." He gestured vaguely at the waterfall. "I've spoken to some investors. We're prepared to make you a more serious offer for this claim. For the water rights." Catherine stood near the entrance to her camp, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. She knew he hadn't come to bargain, he'd come to intimidate. "The claim is not for sale, Mr. Thorne," she said evenly. His smile tightened. "Every claim is for sale. A woman alone has no business trying to manage a property like this. It's a matter of safety. Things can happen out here." The threat hung in the air, as sharp and cold as the mist from the falls. "I can manage," she replied. Thorne's face hardened into a mask of contempt. "You're making a mistake," he snarled before turning to his horse. "A big one." As they rode away, the sky to the west was turning a bruised purple. A storm was coming, and it was a monster. The wind howled down the canyon, tearing at her small lean-to. Rain began to fall, first as fat, sporadic drops, then as a torrential driving sheet. The roar of the waterfall deepened into a terrifying, world-ending thunder. The creek began to rise at an alarming rate. Just as true fear began to set in, she saw a light bobbing through the rain-swept darkness. A wagon, its wheels struggling in the mud, was making its way up the canyon road. A man was leading the horse, his head bent against the storm. As he drew closer, she recognized him. It was James Mercer, the town carpenter and millwright, a quiet, respected widower she had seen only in passing. The wagon held his young daughter, huddled under a blanket. "Our wheel broke," he shouted over the wind. "We were heading to the lumber camp upriver. Can we shelter with you till it passes?" Catherine didn't hesitate. She led them not to her flimsy lean-to, but to the alcove behind the falls. She guided them through the curtain of water into the dry, still chamber. Mercer stared in astonishment at the cut stone walls, the tools, the door. His daughter, a small girl of about 7 named Sarah, looked around with wide, unafraid eyes. Inside, safe from the raging storm, Catherine lit the lantern and, making a decision born of instinct, showed him her father's ledger. James Mercer, a man who understood the language of wood, water, and machinery, turned the pages with a craftsman's reverence. His eyes traced the diagrams for the diversion tunnel, the pressure gate, the specifications for a water wheel. He looked up at her, his expression one of profound respect. "Miss Vale," he said, his voice low with awe, "your father wasn't a fool. He was a genius." In that moment, surrounded by the storm's fury, a partnership was forged, built not on pity, but on shared understanding and the promise of what they could build together. When the storm broke, James Mercer returned to Redemption Gulch, leaving his daughter in Catherine's care for the day, a simple act of trust that spoke volumes. He didn't go to the saloon to spread gossip. He went to the county clerk's office. There, he filed the necessary paperwork to officially register her father's detailed plans and water diversion rights, attaching them as an addendum to her existing claim. He used precise legal language, ensuring her title was ironclad and immune to challenge. Then, he went to the lumber yard and began quietly purchasing timber, not with Catherine's money, but with his own. His reputation in town was solid, built on years of honest work and quiet competence. When people asked what he was doing, he answered simply, "I'm helping Miss Vale build a sawmill." The words, coming from him, carried weight. The whispers in town began to change. The story of Vale's folly, the joke, was replaced by a new story, one of a hidden marvel, of a daughter honoring a father's secret vision. Silas Thorne, hearing the news, stormed into the clerk's office to file a competing claim, citing a vaguely worded mineral rights clause. The clerk, a mild-mannered man who had known Catherine's father, calmly retrieved her file. He laid out the deed, the official survey, and Mercer's newly filed addendum. "Her claim is perfect, Silas," the clerk said, his voice gentle but firm. "The Vale claim predates yours by 20 years, and the water rights are explicitly detailed. There's nothing to challenge." Thorne stood there, defeated not by force or threats, but by the quiet, unassailable power of the law and a good man's foresight. He left the office humbled, the town's attention no longer on him, but on the woman in the canyon. People began to ride out, not to mock, but to see. They stood at a respectful distance, watching as Mercer and a small crew of men he'd hired began laying the stone foundations for a mill, right where her father's plans had indicated. They saw Catherine not as a foolish girl, but as the mistress of a powerful new enterprise, a woman made of the same resilient stone as the canyon she now commanded. Weeks later, the golden light of late afternoon slanted across the canyon, illuminating the rising skeleton of the sawmill. The massive water wheel, crafted by James's own hands, was being hoisted into place, a monument of wood and iron. The controlled rush of water through the newly opened diversion tunnel was a sound of immense, harnessed power, a steady hum that had replaced the chaotic roar of the falls. Catherine and James stood on the ledge before the chamber door, watching the progress. His daughter Sarah sat on the ground nearby, braiding the mane of a patient cinder, her quiet laughter a gentle counterpoint to the sounds of construction. A sense of profound, earned peace settled over the canyon. It was the end of a long struggle and the beginning of a life she had never dared to imagine. James turned to her, a warm, genuine smile on his face. "It's going to be the most powerful mill in the county," he said. "People will bring timber from 50 miles away. What will you call the place? Vale's Mill?" Catherine looked at the spinning water, the fresh-cut pine of the building, the steadfast mountains that cradled them. She thought of her father, of his strange words and his secret labor. She thought of the mockery, the loneliness, and the quiet vindication that now filled her heart. Her gaze was clear and steady as she finally answered. "He didn't leave me a piece of land," she said softly. "He left me a reason." Thank you for staying with us for this story of quiet determination, a testament to finding value where no one else thought to look. If you were moved by Catherine's journey, please give this video a like and let us know your favorite part in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss our next story. We'll see you then.